Sequel definition: a published, broadcast, or recorded work that continues the story or develops the themes of an earlier one. Sequels. What can realistically be said about sequels that hasn't already been said? Well, actually, probably a lot. Sequels as a concept have existed for centuries. Jules Verne wrote an entire trilogy out of Captain Nemo stories. Frank Herbert revisited the world of Dune several times. Louise May Alcott came back and story Little Joe twice. It makes sense that authors want to revisit and re-explore the worlds and the characters that they created. But when it comes to movies, it's an entirely different level of expectations altogether. Sequels to movies have long been a thing as the medium has been in production. Studios love to dust off old stories, return to popular characters as a way to get some quick and easy money. The first official recorded example of a non-short movie sequel dates back to as early as 1916, with a follow-up to 1915's controversial Birth of a Nation, the now lost The Fall of a Nation. This was apparently less of a direct sequel and more of an in-name only cash grab meant to capitalize on the success of the previous film. Sounds kind of familiar, but more examples were quick to follow. When RKO released King Kong in 1933, the movie was enough of a sensation that in one of the first real cases of a studio needing a film for the Christmas season, they rushed out a follow-up, Son of Kong, the exact same year. None of this is particularly new, none of it is surprising. Yet, in recent years, Hollywood has continued to make sequels and franchise follow-ups at such a rapid pace that it feels like it's crowded out just about every other film in the marketplace. Every major film, largely theatrical, that comes out these days feels like it's preordained to have some kind of follow-up in mind. Universal buys the movie rights for Exorcist for $400 million, so David Gordon Green can waste away all that Halloween goodwill further. They got to make a planned trilogy out of it. Netflix greenlights The Gray Man. There's already talks underway before it's even premiered about doing follow-ups. This only begs a question: why does everything seemingly need a sequel? In typical Dan fashion, I like to go through a very brief history of movie sequels, what I think makes a good and a bad franchise starter, and why I'm not so hot in this recent trend. So without further ado, please remember to subscribe, share, and hit that like button. Also, check out my website, danzen.net. Anyways, this is Buckling Up that has 30 more installments in the works. Scrolling down a list of popular movies by decade, say 1935, 1945, 1955 to the present day, one thing that might stand out to you is the lack of directly popular sequels flooding the lists. Oh, to be sure they existed, but sequels and franchises of the past were more throwaway, more B-movie-ish. Films meant for kids or specific demographics, and made on cheaper budgets. Forever the Thin Man or Universal monster movies, later which developed more in this type of film, there were countless Tarzans, Dick Tracys, Charlie Chans, Blondies, and so on. Movies that would recycle sets were often standalone and easy to get into. At a glance, it's easy to see parallels with these films compared to modern day franchises. They were often based on pulp heroes or comic strips. The difference lies in the fact that these were not traditional sequels in the way we now know that phrase, playing more like standalone episodes of early television shows, and B, were not the studio's pride and joy. Those were prestige dramas, adaptations of best-selling books, built on movie stars, sometimes based on true stories, and often up for Oscars. Sometimes those would get sequels, but they were more one-offs, rather than start as something big. Going My Way was followed by The Bells of St. Mary, Father of the Bride was followed by Father's Little Dividend, Mrs. Minerva got a too late follow-up in the Minerva Story, and that's not even getting the show-stopping musical franchises like the Broadway Melody. The thinking even back then was that these movies were almost always destined to do less critically and commercially again, so why go through the hassles of the laws of diminishing returns? So if this is a situation of franchises in the past, how do we get to where we are today? Well, I think we can safely pin everything on our old friend Jimmy James Bond. It was through Bond that the studio started to realize that actually putting some money behind these films with star power wasn't such a bad idea. By the 1970s, the term sequelitis was finally starting to be thrown around to refer to the unprecedented amount of follow-ups that Hollywood was releasing. This was also the time period where the two started to come into play with the title, in reference to the fact that these were direct sequels and not just standalone adventures. This even seeped its way through numerous Best Picture winners and nominees. Of course, who really remembers these movies? Like, did you know there was an entire Virgil Tibbs trilogy? Or that Oliver Story, the follow-up to 1970s box office smash love story, actually exists? That's not even getting into the way too late Treated with a Giant Shrug of features that were 1990's The Two Jakes and Texasville. Then there's something like The Godfather Part 2, maybe the greatest sequel of all time, which was being considered before the first Godfather had even been released. The Godfather Part 2 is the epitome of a great sequel. It builds on the original, adds more depth to the characters, but does it without taking away from what made the first so good. One thing you'll notice about these sequels to the classics during this time period is that they're rarely if ever brought up in conversation with the original. That speaks to one of the best and worst things about a sequel. A great sequel is like an important part of a film's mythology. A terrible sequel will get brought up simply because of the insanity of its quality, but a forgettable or fine sequel falls more in the category of mediocre. They aren't that bad, and it's easy enough to recommend them, but they don't add anything either. The trend of sequelizing everything, though, should be credited to the 1980s, the christening of the blockbuster era, the time period where Hollywood started to push the franchise into maximum gear. Nearly everything that was even vaguely popular enough could have a sequel. It didn't matter if it was a comedy, an action film, or even sometimes a drama. If it was successful enough, it was at least considered, or it got through the scripting phase. So why is this? Well, at one point in the 30s and 40s, the studios were pumping out movies at a ridiculous rate, sometimes 1,000 a year. As the theatrical B-movie died due in part to Hollywood losing its stranglehold in theaters, films becoming longer, and the continued rise of television means being the owner of potentially valuable movie IP is a lot more important than it was decades ago. Another trend that has started to emerge in recent years is a legacy sequel. Legacy sequel, for those who aren't familiar with the phrase, is for a franchise or even one-off of a popular film that has been silent for an X amount of time and is being brought back once again as a sort of 10 or 20 year later reunion. As movies have been rebooted again and again over the years, what constitutes a legacy sequel is complicated and open to interpretation, but what is clear is that these movies play on nostalgia on some level. Legacy sequels as a film concept have basically existed since the 1980s, in some form or another. Arguably Psycho 2 might technically have been the first. Where the phrase started to gain some notoriety was in 2006 with the release of Superman Returns and Rocky Balboa. Live Free or Die Hard followed in 2007, and Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull in 2008. In the decades plus since then, belated long follow-ups to beloved properties have become commonplace in the industry, as Hollywood looks further and further to brands and recognizable names to fill its schedule. Inherently, I have nothing against a legacy sequel on paper. Revisiting the world of longtime characters I enjoy or really like is actually a great thing. Fan service can work for me personally when it hits the right spot and doesn't feel forced. I enjoyed The Force Awakens the first time I saw it. Creed and its sequels might be the best example of a recent legacy series, because it does its best to honor the original Rockies, while still doing its own thing within the framework of a boxing-type underdog story. What I dislike is when a legacy sequel rallies too much around the original, in a way that makes it almost antithetical to the point, where you wonder if the people involved missed the point of the first movie entirely. Ghostbusters Afterlife, for example, sounds completely fine to me. It's a cool little legacy sequel with obvious callbacks to the original film, some of them being better handled than others. That's exactly what the fans want, right? The issue here comes in the fact the movie is caught up so much in being revered and honoring of the original that it loses sight of one of the core elements that made Ghostbusters work in the first place: the jokes. The dividing line between consumer nostalgia and corporate need becomes best exemplified by The Matrix Resurrections, a movie which seems to at best mystify many people, but I actually surprisingly kind of enjoyed. Restrictions is both smart and infuriating at the same time, because it is supposed to be a bit of a splendid commentary on the legacy sequel, the expectations of grappling with recycling the greatest bits, with a premise that is built around the classic let's do it again narrative. However, instead of doing what you think a later day Matrix sequel would do, it does the complete opposite of that, for better or for worse, in a way that feels like it both appreciates and abhors what the original has become. Now, certainly we can argue how successful Matrix Resurrections actually is at what it sets out to do, and certainly some of the elements like the action I wish were better handled, but I appreciate what the movie is going for because it feels refreshing within the boundaries of what a legacy sequel can actually accomplish. Maybe the most curious thing about the film is how it ends in almost definite shutting the door on future installments that most sequels nowadays would avoid like the plague. It's a wonder Warner Brothers decided to greenlight Lana Wachowski's treatment in the first place. This whole discussion of The Matrix Resurrections brings us to the main problem with most modern sequels: the cinematic universe. Believe it or not, but cinematic universes as a concept have actually been around longer than you might expect. Back in the 1940s, there were the Universal Monster movies. Michael Keaton had a cameo in Out of Sight, reprising his role from Jackie Brown. Most famously, Kevin Smith, inspired by his love of comics, had the View Askewniverse, which was a series of movies he directed early on in his career, and then sporadically after. They were connected by numerous characters and locations, particularly Jay and Silent Bob. The differences between old vague cinematic universes and new real cinematic universes is that they were driving force of primarily one person. There wasn't a serious attempt to make zillion spin-offs from various other directors. These days, though, perhaps inspired by the rise of cinematic universes via Marvel, sequels and franchise starters are less self-contained than ever been before. There often has to be some kind of setup at the end, in the vague hope there might be more to come. Think of movie franchises of the past. The first film didn't leave things open to interpretation. Occasionally you get a Godzilla in 1998 or a Masters of the Universe, a movie that was set up for a sequel but never got one. Otherwise, there was a clear setup, arc, and payoff for your protagonists. Ghostbusters ends with the characters kicking butt and celebrating their victories. Back to the Future's last scene was always written as a joke. It's just that when the movie became an unexpected smash, they had to follow it up somehow. Die Hard ends organically with John McClane having saved the day, despite all he's been through, and there isn't even an attempt to imply what his next mission might be. Of course, it's easy to lay the blame on Marvel entirely. After all, they're the culprits behind the recent popularity of the interconnected cinematic universe. But the thing about Marvel is that realistically it made sense for Marvel properties to be connected via a film universe. These are based on stories that have decades and decades of history behind them. I think the issue here is less Marvel and more what producers ultimately got wrong without realizing what made them work in the first place. Executives have desperately tried to crack the Marvel nut for several years now, to little to no avail. Universal fell flat in their face when they tried to start the now infamous Dead Dark Universe with a Tom Cruise failed starter, The Mummy. DC proved they were no Marvel when they rushed right into doing Justice League already after having just done 3 movies beforehand. While Sony is using the Marvel name to make Spider-Man spin-offs, the outside of Venom are for characters that I would describe as not warranting or deserving of their own origin movies. Perhaps most inexplicably though, WB tried to make a modern cinematic universe out of King Arthur, with a planned 6-film series. Sure, they had a lot of strong mythology to go off of, but they didn't even consider how the first movie might be received. Guy Ritchie's hysterically wrongly minded and awful Legend of the Sword came out, it was deemed a critical and commercial disaster, and that dashed all hopes they had of ever making more movies. Having your first film essentially exist as basically being a 2-hour advertisement for your future films never actually works. Even Marvel, for all of its franchise faults, many stemming from this very issue, initially understood this. The other popular cinematic universe outside the MCU, like the Conjuring verse or the Monster verse, happened almost entirely by accident. The first film did well enough, and they just went from there. Expecting that your audience is already along for the ride seems like a fool's errand. When Spielberg made E.T. the Extraterrestrial in 1982, immediately days after the movie had been declared a success, he and screenwriter Melissa Matheson plotted out a 9-page treatment for a potential sequel titled E.T. 2 Nocturnal Fears. The sequel would have taken more of a horror edge and seen Elliot and friends encounter E.T.'s less friendly cousins. A while after the treatment had been penned, Spielberg decided to pull the plug on the project entirely. Spielberg is the same filmmaker who directed 4 Indiana Jones installments and Lost World Jurassic Park. That's not even counting the numerous franchises he's been involved with as a producer. He is clearly not against the concept of sequels. What made E.T. 2 different then? Simply put, it had the cardinal sin that most of the worst sequels do, because in Spielberg's own words, I think a sequel to E.T. would do nothing but rob the original of its virginity. Indiana Jones is an archaeologist who loves treasure hunting. He is built around old serials and has a charming pulp hero, James Bond type demeanor about him. There is always more you can do with that character. E.T. is an alien who makes his way back home at the end of his own movie. His arc is complete. Anything more would come off as redundant or forced. And that speaks to a bigger problem about most sequels these days. Sometimes they just don't know when to quit. The worst offenders when it comes to the sort of logic of thinking are comedies. It's one thing to make a whole franchise out of an action movie, but a comedy? Even for theatrical comedies were a rarity in the industry, they proved to be so much harder to franchise. That is because a lot of comedies are built on a one movie premise. Ideas that can't really be stretched out any further outside of that one film. The Austin Powers or Naked Gun types that actually parody real franchise material stuff like Spies or Cops are the exceptions to the rule. When a comedy does have a sequel, it falls in the trap of repeating the best punchlines from the original, but even worse, often resorting to more ludicrous plot lines just to justify its existence. The first Hangover ended perfectly as is, with our main characters having gotten through the no-good, miserable, worst night situation they found themselves in. When the movie became an unexpected sleeper hit, Warner Brothers was quick to greenlight a follow-up. What did Todd Phillips and company do when they decided to make a sequel? Well, apparently even they realized they couldn't top the ending of the original, so they followed the tried-and-true comedy sequel method of making it the exact same movie, but setting it in Thailand. And don't even get me started on The Hangover 3, which has the opposite problem of 2. If 2 represents the lazy comedy sequel retread, 3 fits more in the outrageous plotline done as a justification for bringing these characters back. Instead of doing another Hangover film, the plot instead hinges on a crime incident related to the second film. All this does, though, is to remind you just how thin the setup and characters are beyond the environment that the first film created. It is also a bizarre movie that seems to hate its audience and what it represents to the point where it comes off as slightly dark and jokeless. It's times like this that I'm reminded I'm glad we dodged a bullet when Universal didn't decide to go through with The Bridesmaids 2, even though they were seriously contemplating it in spite of star co-writer Kristen Wiig's lack of interest in an actual sequel. This is an inherent issue with sequelizing, when a movie that ends perfectly becomes an unexpected surprise, enough to warrant some kind of follow-up. It now becomes a question of what to do next. Either you find a potentially successful new avenue for your main characters to follow, or you wind up starting back from square one. Some sequels do this better than others, because there is clearly some meat left in the bones. But for those that get a sequel solely because of potential profit, it can come off as quite a bit less organic. The modern franchise that I think does this sort of franchise mentality better than most is another Keanu Reeves star, John Wick. The original John Wick was a small little action revenge movie made in 2014, starring an actor at the time who hadn't been really all that relevant. The movie was released, and people were surprised by how well it turned out. Even though the film was only a moderate success, it was enough of a success by Lionsgate standards and sold well in home media that they decided to give the go and greenlight a sequel. John Wick Chapter 2 could merely be a repeat of the original. Writer Derek Kolstad, director Chad Stahelski, and star Keanu Reeves all deserve a lot of credit here. They made one very smart decision. They opened the world up. Each subsequent John Wick movie would be bigger in terms of budget, effects, and action sequences, strengthening the universe and developing the characters further, but in a way that came off as very organic to the story that was set up in the original. While these movies follow a continuous plot thread of some sorts, you could jump right into Chapter 2 without having even seen the first, and you wouldn't be confused at all. Does that mean we have to have a whole extended John Wick universe, complete with spin-offs and a TV show? Well, while I would hope that Ballerina would turn out well, I'm not 100% positive about the idea, because I'm not sure how you can replicate that same sort of magic without Keanu. The great Martin Scorsese is a filmmaker who, whenever his name gets mentioned nowadays, tends to send shivers down the spines of fanboys everywhere. His constant non-hate for Marvel gets instant clicks and responses, and the media is quick to ask him questions about the brand every time he's interviewed. And in long recent chat with GQ regarding his film Killers of the Flower Moon, which I highly recommend reading, Scorsese primarily talked about his morality and how much longer he believes he will keep working on movies. In predictable fashion, the interviewer asked him for his thoughts on Marvel. He called them AI-produced content, and the response went about as well as you might expect. But there's one section I'd like to highlight, and it's not the Marvel section that I just brought up. In that same interview, Scorsese related his own frustrations over the making of The Departed. Scorsese came to the movie with one idea, and the studio had another. Scorsese wanted DiCaprio and Damon dead because it made sense narrative-wise, while Warner Brothers wanted at least one of them to make it out alive. Perhaps the executives were inspired by the original Hong Kong Infernal Affairs, which actually did have sequels. And then the studio guys walked out and they were very sad because they just didn't want that movie. They wanted the franchise, which means I can't work here anymore. I think it's pretty easy to tell here that the executives were in fact not inspired by the Infernal Affairs sequels. Instead, what happened is is that they looked at a movie and they determined that success would be in part based on how much additional material they could squeeze out of it. Even after The Departed ended the way it did, they were still considering doing a spin-off of Mark Wahlberg's character. To the big head honchos, they look at movies, and when they don't see something that immediately screams franchise potential, they get confused. Because conceptually, it just doesn't make any sense. The perfect way to do a sequel is to add what you built from, not subtract or retread completely familiar ground. Avatar: The Way of Water works because Cameron had a good decade plus to build up the environment, the worlds, the characters, the story. You want to jump straight back into Pandora, and you had a reason to do so. Top Gun Maverick was one of the better legacy sequels because it was a great send-up to the original while also having its own strong identity and reason for existing. Mad Max Fury Road is perfect because it's less of a legacy sequel and more of just another Mad Max story, taking what people loved about the Road Warrior and multiplying it by 15 in a perfect blend of exhilarating car-wrecking action and striking visuals. I also wouldn't mind if they did another Barbie as long as Greta Gerwig is involved. But if Mattel decides to make a sequel without her, I'm way less interested in watching it. I have nothing against sequels. Some of my favorite movies are sequels. What I dislike is the need for every major film to be a setup, to just be a pre-plan for future installments, instead of relying on the audiences to be guided through a nearly flawlessly completed journey. We're instead often bombarded with incomplete films that finish just as soon as they start. Maybe it makes sense when you're trying to adapt a source material as thick and complicatedly written as, say, Dune is. But for everything else, it comes off like a case of bad writing. Movies don't have to be high art, but entertainment can and has been so much better than these sloppy retreads.